2 grey wolves and a mountain dog led Constance Farrow to the same frozen creek bed 3 mornings in a row, and on the 3rd morning, what waited beneath the ice stopped her cold. The Cariboo Mountains in early November do not forgive indecision. They reward stillness, patience, and the kind of bone-deep stubbornness that gets mistaken for stupidity by people who have never had to choose between freezing in place or walking further into the dark. Constance had lived on the high ridge for 2 years by then, long enough to know that the animals on this mountain were smarter than most of the people she had left behind in the valley. So when Timber, the big grey shepherd cross she had inherited from the previous trapper who'd abandoned the cabin, started pulling hard on his rope every morning before dawn, dragging her north toward the creek instead of south toward the trap lines, she paid attention. The 2 wolves that had been shadowing the property line since September were doing the same thing. She had named them without intending to. The larger one she called Slate. The smaller, faster female she called Belle, because of the way she moved, silent and sudden, like something wrung and vanished. 3 consecutive mornings, same direction, same place. Constance was not a woman who ignored a pattern. She had come up here for practical reasons she had never fully explained to herself. Her sister in Williams Lake said she was running. Her mother, who had not spoken to her in 2 years before that, and had not spoken to her since, would have said the same thing with considerably less kindness. Constance preferred to call it choosing. There was a difference, even if the geography looked identical from the outside. She pulled on her canvas work jacket, laced her boots in the dark, and followed the animals north. The creek bed was a 20-minute walk from the cabin, uphill through a stand of lodgepole pine so dense that by mid-morning the light still came through in narrow pencil lines. At this hour, just before dawn, it was simply black underneath the trees, and a bruised dark blue overhead. Her breath made a steady cloud. Timber moved ahead of her on the slack rope, not pulling now, but certain. The way dogs get when they've already decided where they're going, and are only waiting for the slower creature behind them to catch up. She heard the creek before she saw it. Not the sound of water. The creek had been frozen solid for 3 weeks. This was something else, a low, labored sound, wet and intermittent, like something breathing between clenched teeth. Constance stopped. Her hand went to the knife on her hip, then moved to the rifle slung across her back, then stilled entirely. She listened. Timber had stopped too, his large body blocking the narrow gap between 2 spruce trees. His ears were up, completely motionless, aimed like instruments. She moved him aside with a firm press of her knee and stepped through. The creek bed was a shallow depression in the land, maybe 3 meters across. Banks built up with frozen mud and brown dead grass that stuck up through the snow like the remnants of something unfinished. The ice in the center was pale and thick, cloudy with trapped air, and against the far bank, wedged between an exposed root and a heavy fall of snow that had collapsed. From the spruce above there was a person, a woman. She was lying on her side, half buried in the snow that had come down on top of her. She was wearing a heavy wool coat that had once been dark green and was now mostly brown with cold and filth. Her hair was loose, dark, frozen in places where it had pressed against the creek bank. One hand was visible, curled against her chest. The fingers were the wrong color. Constance crossed the ice in 4 steps. She dropped to her knees. The woman's eyes were closed, her lips were cracked and pale and tinged with the particular blue. That means a body's working very hard just to stay in the world. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of the woman's throat. A pulse, fast and faint, like something trying to signal from a very long distance. "All right," Constance said aloud to nobody in particular. Her own voice sounded strange to her. She had not spoken out loud in 4 days. "All right." She assessed quickly, the way her father had taught her, before she'd decided to stop listening to most of what her father said. The hand that was visible was badly frostbitten on 2 fingers. She would deal with that later or not at all, depending on how the next hour went. There was blood on the woman's coat, low on the right side, soaked through and frozen. Not fresh, old enough that the bleeding had stopped, or the cold had stopped it, which was not the same thing at all. She could not see the wound beneath the layers of clothing. She would not look here in the open, in the cold, with the sky just beginning to pale at the edges. She had to get her inside. Constance was not a large woman. She was built compact and capable, the kind of person who looks unremarkable until there is work to be done. She got the woman up in a fireman's carry which was ugly and graceless, and required 3 attempts and language she usually saved for the generator when it wouldn't start. The woman groaned once during the second attempt, which was the most hopeful sound Constance had heard in a long time. Groaning meant still there, still fighting the body's desire to simply give in. Timber walked beside her on the way back. Slate and Bell trailed at the edge of the trees, visible as shadows, present in the way wild things sometimes are when they've decided you belong to the same arrangement. The cabin was small and cold. When they entered, the fire burned down to coals. Constance deposited the woman onto the narrow cot along the east wall, ungently, because there was no other way, and immediately began feeding the stove. Birch bark, then kindling, then 2 solid pieces of split jack pine. She didn't wait for warmth. She pulled the woman's frozen coat off, cutting 2 buttons loose because the cold had swollen the wool and made them impossible, and found what she'd expected beneath, a wound in her right side, entry and exit, from something small caliber, a rifle at distance or a pistol up close. The bleeding had slowed to almost nothing, held shut by cold and luck, and the particular stubbornness of a body that hadn't finished deciding yet. Constance had a small first aid kit, a good one. The kind wilderness outfitters sell to people who actually intend to use them rather than store them in a truck. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic that made her own eyes water to smell, packed it with gauze and bound it tight with the kind of compression that would hurt when the woman woke up. If she woke up. Frostbite on the 2 fingers. Not the worst kind, but not trivial. She wrapped them separately, carefully, with the method she'd read about in a wilderness medicine manual years ago and never expected to actually need. She pried the woman's boots off. The feet were cold but not damaged. Small mercies. She pulled every blanket in the cabin onto the cot, 2 wool camp blankets and a down sleeping bag that she usually hoarded, tucked them around the woman's body with particular attention to the extremities, and then sat down on the floor with her back against the stove and her knees pulled up to her chest and watched her breathe. The fever came on fast, the way it does when a body has been holding back an infection with the cold and suddenly finds itself warm enough to let the fight begin in earnest. By mid-morning, the woman was burning through the blankets, throwing them off every 20 minutes. She was talking, not words, not exactly. Sound that had the shape of words, urgent and slurred, the kind of speech that happens when the mind is speaking to things that aren't in the room. Constance listened despite herself. Most of it was lost, but 3 things came through clearly, repeated with the kind of emphasis that suggested they mattered very much to whoever was saying them. The first was a name, Whiston, said like a question, like an accusation, like a wound. The second was a phrase, the blue envelope. The third was not a word at all, but a sound. A short, sharp intake of breath followed by what Constance eventually understood was weeping. Though no tears came because there was not enough fluid left in the body for tears, Constance did not ask about any of it. She made broth from dried elk bouillon and melted snow, forced small amounts of it between the woman's cracked lips every hour, and waited. The fever broke sometime before dawn on the second day. Constance knew it before she was fully awake. The quality of breathing in the room had changed. She sat up from where she had been dozing against the stove and found the woman looking at her, eyes open, fully present. Dark brown, set deep, the face around them still paper pale and marked with exhaustion, but aware. "You snore," the woman said. Her voice was gravel and rust, barely audible, but the words were clear. Constance blinked the sleep from her eyes. "You bled on my camp blanket," she replied. The woman closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The feral, closed-off wariness that Constance had seen in 100 animals when cornered was still there, but held a little looser. "Where am I?" 30 kilometers north of the Clearwater Road. "Private property." Constance stood up, her back protesting audibly. She walked to the stove, stoked the fire, put the kettle on. "You were in the creek bed. Timber found you." "Who is Timber, the dog?" Constance gestured without looking at the cot. "Don't try to sit up yet. You'll tear the bandaging." The woman did not listen. A sharp hiss of pain followed, and then a moment of very deliberate stillness. "You're good at this," she said finally, her voice tight with the effort of not moving again. "I'm adequate," Constance replied, "and I had time." The kettle took a long time. The silence that filled the cabin while they waited was the particular kind that happens between two people who are both deciding how much to offer. The woman on the cot spoke first, which surprised Constance. "My name is Lael," she said. Constance poured the boiling water into 2 tin cups, dropped a tea bag into each, and carried them to the cot. She sat on the upturned crate she had been using as a stool. She handed 1 cup to Lael, watching her manage it with her uninjured hand. "Constance," she said. Lael nodded. She looked at the tea with the careful concentration of a person who is using small tasks to keep themselves upright. "I don't suppose," she said slowly, "that you saw anyone else on the ridge?" "No." Lael let out a slow breath. Some of the tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. "How long was I out there?" "Best I can figure, 2 days. Maybe 2.5. Constance drank her tea and kept her eyes on the woman's face. "The wound in your side is old enough. You were moving before you went down." "I was." Lael looked at her fingers, the 2 that were wrapped. "Will I keep them?" "Probably. The wrapping goes for another day at least. Don't unwrap it to look." Lael didn't answer. She held the tin cup with both hands. The wrapped fingers curved awkwardly around the warm metal. Outside, the wind had picked up, throwing snow against the single window in a dry, rhythmic scratch. "You were talking in your fever," Constance said. Not because she meant to, but because the question had been sitting in her chest since the night before, and she was not a patient woman when it came to things she needed to understand. "You said a name, Whiston." Lael's hands tightened on the cup, just for a moment, then deliberately eased. "My brother," she said. Constance waited. He had a fishing lodge on the Stewart Lake. Small operation. Just him. 40 acres and a private dock. Lael's voice had gone flat, the way voices do when the emotion underneath is too large to let surface. She stared at the middle distance. "Last April, there was a fire. They said he'd left a propane line open in the equipment shed. They said he must have lit a cigarette without thinking." She stopped. "He didn't smoke," Constance said. "He didn't smoke," Lael confirmed. Her eyes moved back to Constance's face. "He'd been in a dispute with Harwick Industries for 8 months. They wanted to buy his property, the lake frontage specifically. They were building a private resort corridor across the North Shore. He said no. He said it twice in writing, and once in person, in their boardroom, in front of their lawyer." Constance set her cup down on the floor beside her boot. "6 weeks after the fire, I found a man named Whiston Garrick. He worked for Harwick's property division. I'd been going through every document I could find from the company. Acquisition records, correspondence, anything. Public. His name came up 3 times in connection with properties that had changed hands after what the fire marshal called accidental fires." Lael's voice was steady. Too steady. The steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this until they stopped feeling it and then kept going past the point where they started feeling it again. "I'm a paralegal. I know how to read documents. I found enough to bring to the RCMP. I went to the detachment in Prince George the 2nd week of October." "And?" Constance asked. "And the duty sergeant took my name, my contact information, and the names of the documents I had copies of. Lael looked at her, and 4 days later, 2 men came to my apartment. The fire in the stove popped and shifted. A log settled. The sound of the wind against the window was constant and indifferent. "Where are the copies?" Constance asked. I kept the originals digitally, backed up to 3 places. Lael's eyes were steady on her, but the physical copies, the ones I printed and annotated by hand, with my notes in the margins, those I hid, locker, in Smithers. I have the key. She paused. I had the key. Where's it now? Sewn into the lining of my coat. A beat. The coat I was wearing when I went into the creek. Constance was quiet for a moment. She turned her head and looked at the green coat hanging on the hook by the door. I cut 2 buttons, she said. I didn't cut the lining. Something moved in Lael's face. Not relief exactly. Relief implies the expectation that things will be fine, and she was too far past that for it. More like the very small adjustment a compass needle makes when it finally finds north. We should have this conversation later, Constance said, standing up. When you can hold a cup without your hands shaking, they're not. Lael looked down. Her hands were, in fact, shaking. Eat something, Constance said, not unkindly. Then sleep. The key will still be in the coat in 4 hours. Lael did not sleep, but she ate. Dried moose jerky and the last of a tin of soup, consumed with the single-minded focus of a body that has realized what hunger actually means. Constance went out to check the traps, and to think, the way she always thought, which was with her body moving and her eyes on the middle distance. Timber walked beside her without being told. Slate was somewhere in the trees to the west. She could see Belle's tracks crossing the open patch near the small meadow, fresh from this morning. The question was a practical one, the way most serious questions eventually became practical if you waited long enough. Lael could not travel, not yet. The wound was healing, but the infection in it was not finished working, and 2 days in the cold had cost her body resources it would take time to replenish. She could walk, probably, by tomorrow. She could not walk 30 kilometers. She could not manage the terrain between here and the road, not in this weather, not in her current state. Constance had a snow machine, a 12-year-old Arctic cat with a tendency to run rough in temperatures below -20, but functional. She had fuel enough for the road and back. She had not been to the road in 6 weeks. She had not been intending to go for another 3. At minimum, which was the plan she had made for herself in September, and had been following with the kind of rigid contentment that comes from having eliminated most variables. She checked her second trap, found it empty, reset it, and stood up. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin. When she opened the door, Lael was sitting up on the cot with the coat across her lap. The lining had been partially pulled back from the hem with her good hand. She held up a small silver key between her wrapped fingers. She looked at Constance with that careful, measuring steadiness. I need to get to Smithers, she said. I know, Constance said. You don't have to. I know that too. Constance closed the door behind her. She leaned her rifle against the wall and began pulling her outer layer off, hanging it on the second hook. You should know something before you say anything else about what I have or don't have to do. Lael waited. I don't do this kind of thing, Constance said. She was not looking at Lael. She was hanging up her jacket with the focus of a person who is choosing her words with the same care she uses for everything else. I came up here specifically to not do this kind of thing. I have a very functional arrangement with this mountain, which is that I don't bother it and it doesn't bother me. I have food for the winter, adequate fuel, and a plan that does not involve other people's emergencies. Then why? Because Timber found you. Constance turned around. Her expression was entirely level, not cold but not warm, the expression of someone who is being honest without being confessional. And Slate, and Belle. 3 animals who have never once agreed on anything led me to the same place 3 days in a row. I am not sentimental, but I am not stupid either. When the mountain shows you something that specific, You'd be a fool not to look." Lael was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Thank you." "Don't," Constance said. "It won't make what comes next easier for either of us." The next morning, the temperature had dropped to -27. The Arctic cat started on the third pull, which was better than usual. Constance strapped a sleeping bag around Lael's midsection, over her coat, not for warmth, but to provide some pressure on the wound, against the vibration of travel, which was a trick she had read about in the same manual. It probably wouldn't work perfectly. It was better than nothing. Lael climbed on behind her, without being told to hold on, and held on. They were 30 minutes out when Constance saw the truck. It was parked at an angle across the narrow service road that was the only access point to her property from the main logging road, 20 meters ahead. Dark blue, a heavy 3/4 ton, idling. 2 men stood beside it in the kind of heavy outerwear that suggested money, not the worn functionality of people who worked outside, but the studied performance of people who had been told to look like they worked outside. Constance stopped the machine. One of the men raised a hand. The gesture was meant to look like a greeting. It did not look like a greeting. She felt Lael's arms tighten around her waist. "I see them," Constance said. She did not move forward. She sat on the idling machine in the middle of the open track, and she looked at the 2 men and the truck for a long moment. Then she reached down and shut the engine off. The silence that dropped over the land was sudden and absolute. Wind in the trees, the distant knock of a woodpecker somewhere to the east. The subdued clink of the cooling engine. "We're looking for a woman," the nearer man called out. His voice carried easily in the cold air. "She went missing in this area a week ago. Family's very worried." Constance stepped off the machine. She was carrying her rifle, slung across her body. She did not unsling it. She walked forward 10 steps and stopped. "No missing women up this way," she said. Her voice came out flat and carrying, shaped by the same terrain it moved through. "I've been running traps since October. I'd have noticed." The man glanced at his companion. The glance was quick and practiced, the kind that passes information without appearing to. "Mind if we look around a bit?" He had a pleasant voice. He used it the way certain men use pleasant voices, as a form of pressure. "This is private property," Constance said. "Posted since the gate. I heard you the first time." She had stopped walking. She was standing in the snow, with her arms loose at her sides, and her weight distributed evenly, the way she stood when she was splitting wood, or when she was waiting for something decided. She was equal to. If a woman went missing in this area, the right call is the Vanderhoof detachment, not a private drive down a posted road. I'll give you the number if you've misplaced it. The second man, the one who hadn't spoken, moved his hand slightly, not toward a weapon, but in that direction. Constance unslung the rifle. She didn't raise it. She held it in both hands across her body, at a low angle that was not threatening, and was not threatening. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, in the same steady tone she used for every difficult thing. "You're going to get back in your truck. You're going to back out to the logging road. And if I see this vehicle on this property again, I'm going to photograph the plates and contact both the RCMP and the company you work for. Because we both know that's a company vehicle, and that means there is a paper trail that leads back to someone who has something to lose." The pleasant man's face did not change. Exactly. It became more careful. "The woman's family is genuinely concerned," he said. "I don't doubt it," Constance replied. "Back out, please." There was a pause, the kind of pause where calculations happen. Then the second man, the one who hadn't spoken and had started to, with his hand, turned and opened the truck door. The pleasant man held Constance's gaze for one more moment. Then he walked to the passenger side. The truck reversed in a long, slow arc, found the wider point in the road, and turned. Constance watched it until it was gone. She stood in the middle of the track for another minute, after the sound of it had faded, her eyes on the tree line. Her breathing even. She heard the creak of the snow machine. She turned. Lael had climbed off and was standing beside it, one hand pressed to her side, her face the color of old snow. She had heard everything. "They'll wait," Lael said. "Probably," Constance agreed, "at the main road, or they'll circle back after dark. Yes, we can't go that way." Constance looked at the sky. Clear and brutal, blue all the way to the edges. The kind of day that is beautiful and actively trying to kill you. "No," she said, "we can't go that way." She was quiet for a moment. "There's an old trapper's track that runs northeast from the back of my property. It hits a forestry road about 18 kilometers out. That road connects to the highway 12 kilometers north of the main junction." She paused. "It hasn't been graded. The machine will manage most of it. The last 2 kilometers before the highway junction are open swamp, frozen now. If the ice holds, we cross. If it doesn't, we go around, which adds 4 kilometers. Lael was watching her. "Have you done it before?" "The ice holds," Constance said. "Most years." Lael closed her eyes briefly then. "All right." They went back to the cabin. Constance loaded what she needed, with the efficiency of someone who has packed for emergencies in her head so many times that the physical act is just the thought made real. Extra fuel in the auxiliary can, the first aid kit, her documentation, property papers, identification, stored in a waterproof sleeve inside her chest pocket. The small camera she used for noting trap locations on a memory card she tucked into the same pocket. She was not certain what they were walking into. She preferred to be the one with evidence. She handed Lael the coat with the repaired lining. "What about the key?" Lael asked. "Keep it in your pocket," Constance said. "Not the coat this time." They took the back route in the late afternoon, which meant hitting the swamp crossing at dusk, which was not ideal. The forestry road was rough enough that Constance slowed to half her usual speed, which meant the cold had more time to work. Lael's grip around her waist stayed steady. The woman did not complain. This was a quality Constance had not expected and found she appreciated with a depth that surprised her. The swamp was 1/2 kilometer across at its narrowest. The ice was thick. She tested it at the edge with a pole she had brought for exactly this reason. And the crossing took 11 minutes and cost her approximately 4 years off some portion of her life she probably hadn't been using well anyway. She didn't breathe properly until they were on the far bank, on solid ground, the machine's engine still running steady under them. Lael exhaled into her back. "Most years," she said. "This was a good year," Constance replied. The highway junction appeared at full dark, marked by the reflectors on the guardrail, and the sound of a transport truck somewhere ahead. They came out of the trees onto the plowed shoulder, and for a moment the normalcy of the road. The tarmac, the lane markings just visible under a skin of packed snow. The distant glow of a gas station sign. Felt profoundly unreal. Constance pulled to a stop. "I'm going to call someone," Lael said. Her voice was different on the highway, more contained, more guarded. "Someone I trust, not RCMP. A journalist I worked with twice before. She's in Prince George. Do you have your phone?" Lael reached into her inside coat pocket and produced a phone that had been through things. She held it. "It's been off for a week. Turn it on and make the call, then take the battery out." Lael looked at her, then nodded. The call took 4 minutes. Constance didn't listen to the words. She listened to the tone, the shift from clipped and cautious to something quieter and more real that happened about halfway through, when the person on the other end must have said something that meant she was believed. Lael ended the call, removed the battery with the calm efficiency of someone who has thought about this, and put both pieces in separate pockets. She looked at Constance. "She's coming," Lael said. 2 hours. There's a rest stop 3 kilometers north," Constance said. "We wait there." They waited there. The journalist arrived in a small Subaru that was approximately 12 years old and had 2 different colored side mirrors, and she pulled into the lot and got out without hesitation, moving toward Lael with the purposeful steadiness of someone who is frightened and doing the thing anyway. Her name was Deb. She was small and wore a toque with a pom-pom on it that was completely at odds with the gravity of her face. She embraced Lael briefly and hard, then pulled back and looked at her with the quick professional assessment of someone accustomed to people in worse shape than they're letting on. "You look terrible," Deb said. "I know," Lael said. Then Deb looked at Constance, and there was the beginning of a question in her face. "The mountain helped," Lael said. "It was not an explanation." Deb seemed to understand that it was the one that was being offered, and accepted it with a short nod. She opened the passenger door of the Subaru. Constance stood by the snow machine. The cold was absolute and clean, the way it gets in the mountains after midnight, when all the moisture has gone out of the air, and there is nothing left but the temperature itself. Lael did not say thank you. Constance had told her not to. She stood at the car door and looked back and said, very directly, "The storage locker in Smithers. When this is done, I'm going to need someone who can document what that property looks like, what the creek looks like, where you found me." "I know where I found you," Constance said. "I know you do," Lael replied. "I'm asking if you'll show someone else." Constance thought about the creek bed, the way it looked in the dark, the particular quality of the frozen mud and the dead grass coming up through the snow. She thought about Timber moving ahead of her in the pre-dawn, certain and patient. She thought about Slate and Belle at the tree line, quiet as held breath, keeping watch. "When this is done," Constance said, "come back up the hill." The Subaru left. The taillights shrank and disappeared around the bend in the highway. The sound of the engine faded into the long silence of the northern night. Constance stood in the empty parking lot. The cold pressed against every surface it could reach. Overhead, the stars were preposterous in their number, the way they only get this far north and this far from anything electrical, too many to pass into individual points of light, just a wash of it. The whole sky burning with the quiet, impersonal evidence that the world is larger than any single trouble. She got back on the machine. She turned north. She was not going toward anything she'd planned. She was not following a schedule she'd made in September, or a logic she could have defended 2 weeks ago. She was following the same impulse that had made her follow Timber north 3 mornings in a row, a wordless certainty that some things, once seen, cannot be walked past, and that the mountain she lived on had known that long before she did. She rode back into the dark. The trees closed around her. The cold was hers again. Behind her, somewhere on the highway heading south toward Prince George, a woman carried a silver key and everything it opened, and the truth that the mountain had kept safe until someone thought to look.